California. Late spring. The kind of day where the sun feels too bright for a hospital room. Hi, I'm Lena. I'm 33. I live just outside Sacramento. I ended up in the ER that week. It wasn't routine, it was serious. I told my parents. I thought they'd come, but they went to my sister's award ceremony instead. I remember watching the live stream from my hospital bed, hearing them cheer, seeing them smile, and for the first time, I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. Have you ever been left behind by the people you thought would show up? If you've ever felt that kind of silence, I hope you'll share. I read every comment. I remember the sound before anything else. The beeping. Not loud, not alarming. Just steady, like a question I didn't know how to answer. Every few seconds, the IV would release a tiny click into my bloodstream. A nurse's voice echoed faintly from the hallway, then faded. Someone wheeled a cart past my room and didn't stop. I kept thinking they would stop. That someone would turn the handle, lean their head in, say my name in that overbright voice people use when they're late but pretending not to be. But no one came in. The chair stayed empty. Not just for a minute. Not just through the first hour. The whole day. At first, I told myself they must be stuck in traffic. Then I imagined my mom sitting by the phone, not knowing which room I was in. Then I pictured her at the front desk, filling out some insurance form, trying to remember my birthday. But I never heard her voice. I never saw her face. By early afternoon, I stopped waiting the way I had been. I turned toward the wall, stared at the spot where the light from the IV machine cast a blinking green glow. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, she asked if I needed anything. I said no. She hesitated, then asked again. Not about pain or nausea. She asked if anyone was coming. I looked away when I said, "They're busy today." I don't know if she believed me. I'd told them 2 nights before. The symptoms, the ER visit, the test results. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't routine. It was a flare. My first one this bad. They said they'd see how things go. That was the phrase. The one that kept spinning around in my chest like a paper cut that wouldn't close. We'll see how things go. By late afternoon, I opened my phone. I told myself I was checking the time. But that wasn't true. I was checking for them. No missed calls. No unread messages. Just a string of notifications. And then the live stream started. It took a second to register what I was looking at. The auditorium. The rows of parents in iron shirts and quiet dresses. Someone was handing out programs at the door. It was bright, but not warm. Ceremony lighting, rehearsed smiles, applause ready before the names were called. And then there she was. My sister, hair curled, new dress. That look on her face, polished, poised, like she'd stepped out of a catalog that said, "Exceptional daughter." She walked across the stage and accepted her award. Something about community leadership, I think. I don't remember what they called it. I only remember my mother's voice, cheering from the second row. I hadn't realized they were streaming with sound. It felt like she was in the room with me, not looking at me, not speaking to me, just echoing through my phone in a voice that hadn't said my name all day. I could hear her clapping. I could hear my dad, too, saying something I couldn't make out. Probably to someone beside him, or behind the camera. I watched them smiling. I watched everyone smiling, and I felt something break in a place I didn't know was still holding. I want to say I cried. I want to tell you I wept into the hospital pillow, that the silence finally split, and something holy came pouring out. But I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything, honestly. Except maybe cold. Not the temperature kind. The kind that starts in your chest and seeps down through your legs until it settles in your feet, and you realize you've been still for too long. I kept the live stream open longer than I meant to. Not because I was proud. Not because I cared about the speeches or the awards or the theme music they played every time a student's name was called. I kept it open because I didn't know what to look at if I closed it. Because the room I was in was white and silent and humming, and the room they were in was full of sound. Of proof. Of joy that didn't have space for me. When the feed ended, I laid the phone on my chest and stared at the ceiling. A nurse walked past again. She didn't look in. The chair by my bed, the one I kept glancing at without realizing, was still there, still empty, still waiting for someone to sit down and say, "I'm here." No one did. Not that day. Not the next. The room stayed empty, and for the first time in a long time, so did I. The day after I was discharged, my mother called. Not right away, not first thing. It was late afternoon, almost evening, and her voice sounded too light, like she'd forgotten she was supposed to be worried. She asked how I was feeling. I said, "Better." That was true in the way a body can be better before a heart is. I could sit up. The bruises had faded, but something else had started to ache, something I couldn't find a name for. She talked about the ceremony for a while. How lovely it had been. How proud they were. How the flowers from the school were still sitting on the kitchen table, even though they were beginning to wilt a little. I waited for her to say something else, something about me, about why they hadn't come. But all she said was, "We weren't sure if it was serious." I remember holding the phone a little tighter in that moment. Not hard, just enough to feel it press into the skin of my palm. We weren't sure if it was serious. It echoed, the way certain sentences do when they hit a part of you that hasn't fully healed, as if seriousness had always been the requirement, as if love was something you had to qualify for. I told her I understood, and part of me meant it, because I've always been the one to smooth the edges, to make things okay before they've had time to cut. She said they were going to visit my sister later that night. She had a follow-up dinner with her school's board, something about scholarship donors. "They really see something in her," she said. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "She's always been so poised," she added. There was a pause after that. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but it stretched like something trying not to break. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a while. Then I walked to the kitchen and opened a drawer full of old paper. Medical bills, birthday cards, one unopened envelope from the year I got laid off. I'd never looked inside it. At the very bottom, I found a note I'd written years ago, a post-it stuck to the back of an expired insurance form. It said, "Don't be dramatic. Don't make things harder." I don't remember writing it, but I remember living it. Later that evening, my dad texted me. Just one sentence. "Glad you're doing okay?" No question mark, no follow-up. I stared at the screen for a long time. I wanted to ask him something, anything, that might make it make sense. Why they chose the ceremony, why no one showed up, why I had to explain my absence to a nurse instead of the people who raised me. But I didn't write back, not right then. That night, I dreamed I was sitting at a long table covered in silver dishes. My sister was at the center. Everyone was clapping. I tried to speak, but my voice came out in a whisper. No one turned their head. No one looked at me. When I reached for the fork beside my plate, it was gone. I woke up with my fingers curled into the bedsheet. The next morning, my aunt called. She's always been the quieter one in the family, less showy, more kind. She asked how the hospital went, said she heard I was back home now. Then she said, "I saw the pictures from the award night. Everyone looked so proud." There was something in the way she said it, like maybe she knew, or maybe I just wanted her to. I asked if my parents had mentioned anything about me. She hesitated. "They said you were fine," she replied. And then, after a beat, "They thought it was just a checkup." I hung up, and the silence came back. But it wasn't the clean kind. It had weight to it now. Texture. Like a coat that didn't fit anymore, but you kept wearing it because it used to keep you warm. They thought it was just a checkup, but I'd sent them everything. The scan results, the diagnosis, the doctor's note about the risk. I reread the message I'd sent my mother, word for word. I even checked the time it was marked as delivered. She'd read it. The little notification said, "Seen." She saw it. I didn't cry. Not that morning. Not even when I found the discharge papers still folded in the bottom of my bag. Instead, I stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection for a long time. My skin was pale, the circles under my eyes a little darker than usual, But that wasn't what caught me. It was the way my mouth looked, like it had been holding something in for too long. I practiced saying it out loud, just once. It hurt. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like something borrowed. So I said it again. It hurt. Still quiet, still small, but mine. They called it a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't echo like this. They don't follow you through your dreams or hide in the voice you use with yourself when no one else is listening. What they called a mix-up, I carried like a sentence. And even now, even here, there's a part of me that still wants to believe they meant well. That it really was confusion. That they didn't know. That if they'd understood what I needed, they would have come. But the truth is, I did tell them, and they didn't. And that's what keeps me up now. Not what they said, but what they didn't. It didn't start with the hospital. That's the part I keep circling back to. As if maybe, if it were just that one moment, just that one weekend, I could forgive it more easily. Tuck it into a drawer with all the other misunderstandings and move on. But it didn't start there. It just finally said out loud what had always been whispered. I was 12 the first time I noticed it. My sister had just won some regional spelling bee, and there was a small ceremony in the school gym. She wore a white dress. I wore jeans with a hole in the knee. I don't think anyone noticed me standing in the back, holding a wilted carnation I'd bought with lunch money. That same week, I got a perfect score on a history project I'd spent 3 weeks on. Hand-drawn maps, a poster board with glued cutouts, a written report, 6 pages, typed. When I showed it to my parents, they smiled. My mother said, "Good job, sweetie." Then she turned back to helping my sister rehearse for her next competition. It was like that, always. Not cruel, not loud, just waited. Like some part of the room always leaned in her direction. Like I could work twice as hard and still never get the light to reach me. And for a long time, I thought that was fair. She was exceptional, after all. Gifted, driven, beautiful in that polished, brochure-ready way. I was quieter, better at noticing things than saying them. I didn't sparkle, I just stayed close to the wall. In high school, it got worse. She became the student the teachers fawned over, the one whose name got whispered in the front office as a future leader. I became the one they forgot to call on, even when my hand was raised. I still remember one parent-teacher night. My dad walked past my classroom to sit in on hers. He said mine had already ended. He said he thought I'd understand. I nodded. Of course I understood. I always did. Even birthdays felt different. Her 16th was a catered backyard dinner with a string quartet and 2 cakes. Mine was pizza and a candle we had to relight 3 times because it wouldn't stay lit. No one took pictures at mine. Or maybe they did, but I never saw them. The phrase my father used, more than once, was, "She just makes things easier." He meant it as a compliment to her, but it always felt like a sentence for me. I don't think my sister meant to take up all the air. She just did. She was the kind of person people lean toward, and I learned quietly how to fold myself smaller, so there'd be more space for everyone else. The hospital was just a confirmation, not a rupture, not a shock. Just the final quiet proof that even when I was the one bleeding, she was still the one they showed up for. After I got home, I found a photo album in a dusty box under my bed. It had our names written on the cover in marker, one of those old thick Sharpies that bleed around the edges. Inside there were school photos, holidays, recitals, awards. Her pictures were mounted. Mine were slid in sideways. No labels, no dates, just loose corners. I flipped through every page slowly, half hoping I was imagining it, that I'd find some tucked-away evidence that I'd been more than a footnote, but I didn't. I closed the album and set it beside me on the floor. It felt heavier than it should have. Later that night, I opened an old group text from years ago. My parents, my sister, me. The last message I sent in that thread was about a promotion I got at work. No one replied. The message right above it? A photo of my sister winning an award. 10 responses. 3 heart emojis. I stared at that screen for a long time, watching the blue check marks glow. I think the hardest part was realizing I had accepted it. For years. Without question. Like a rule carved into the foundation of our house. She goes first. You go quietly. And when you spend your life being second, you start to believe that's all you're worth. You don't ask for more. You don't expect it. You tell yourself it's enough just to be nearby. But it's not. It's not enough to be the one clapping in the back row, hoping someone turns around. It's not enough to get better in a hospital bed with no one sitting beside you. It's not enough to keep swallowing your voice just to make other people feel taller. It didn't start with the hospital, but that's where it stopped being invisible. That's where the silence finally felt like the answer. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to unhear it. It was a Tuesday. Quiet outside. Gray sky through the window. I remember the nurse's shoes first. Soft-soled, careful. The way she nudged the door with her elbow, carrying a glass vase filled with yellow tulips. For a moment, just a moment, I thought they were for me. My whole body shifted. Not much. Just that tiny forward movement your chest makes when it believes it might finally be seen. But she didn't stop at my bed. She turned left, 2 doors down, and vanished. I watched the flowers disappear like a gift wrapped in someone else's name. I didn't cry. I just laid my head back and stared at the white tile above me, wondering if yellow tulips had a meaning I didn't know. Later, the nurse came back to check my vitals. She smiled gently, adjusted the cuff on my arm, said something about the weather. I don't think I responded. Before she left, she paused by the end of my bed and said, "You doing okay?" I nodded. Because that's the version of me they expect. The one who says she's fine, even when the air feels thick and unbreathable. She nodded too, and left. That night, when the hallway quieted and the lights dimmed, I thought about all the times I'd watched care pass me by. Not in dramatic ways, not in slammed doors or shouted words, just like this. Gentle, casual, someone handing something beautiful to someone else, and walking past me. There was a birthday, maybe my 9th, when I asked for a gold bracelet I'd seen in the window of a small boutique downtown. Nothing expensive, just a thin band with a charm shaped like a moon. I remember showing it to my mother. I remember how she said, "Maybe next year." On my birthday, I opened a set of scented pencils and a card signed with only their names. No message, no note. The next week, I saw the bracelet on my sister's wrist. She said she didn't know it was the same one I'd wanted. I smiled, said it looked pretty on her, and meant it, even as something inside me curled in quiet. There's a strange kind of grief that comes from not being chosen, not from being hated, not even from being hurt, just overlooked, again and again, until your skin starts to memorize the shape of absence. After I was discharged, I walked into my apartment and smelled flowers. For a second, I thought someone had sent some, but it was just a neighbor's bouquet, left in the hallway near their door. A celebration of something I would never know. I stood there longer than I should have, just breathing it in, pretending. I think people assume grief has to be loud, that it comes with sobbing or shaking or some visible fracture. But the deepest grief I've ever known has always arrived quietly. No announcement, no apology, just a hollowing, a space where someone should have been. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that bouquet of yellow tulips. I see the way the stems tilted slightly to one side, like they were leaning toward the person they were meant for. And I wonder if they knew they were being carried past me, if anything in them wilted at the sound of my silence. There's a drawer in my nightstand where I keep small things. Ticket stubs. A stone from a beach trip no one remembers but me. A ribbon from a third-grade art contest I didn't win, but someone told me I should have. And in that drawer, tucked under an old envelope, is a card. It says, "Get well soon," typed, no signature. It was left behind by a volunteer who stopped by my room with a basket of generic greetings. I kept it. Not because it meant anything, but because it reminded me how strange it is. The way strangers sometimes offer more comfort than family. I've never received flowers in a hospital, not once. But I remember the smell, the way the petals curled at the edges, the rustle of the paper as the nurse adjusted her grip. That bouquet was never mine, but part of me still remembers how it almost was. That's the ache no one sees. Not the absence itself, but the moment you think it's been filled, only to watch it keep walking. I thought about texting someone. Once. Maybe twice. I had the message written out. Something simple, something light. Back home, still a little tired. But I never pressed send. It felt too strange to announce something so quiet. Too strange to share the ache of being left behind when I didn't even know how to explain why it mattered. Because technically, I was fine. Out of the hospital, recovering, breathing. No one asks about what doesn't bruise. I went to dinner with friends the Friday after I got back. A little Italian place downtown. Brick walls, candles, the sound of cutlery clinking against porcelain. It was the kind of place people go when they're celebrating something. I wasn't celebrating. I was pretending. I laughed in the right places. Told a story about the Uber driver who missed my exit twice. Sipped water like it was wine, even though my hands were still shaky and my voice kept catching in the back of my throat. No one asked why I looked tired. No one knew to. Because I hadn't told anyone. Not really. There's a kind of silence that feels like protection. And then there's the kind that becomes a habit. I don't know when mine crossed from one into the other. But it did. And now it's like a second skin I forget I'm wearing. I used to write things down, not for anyone else. Just for me? Late at night, in the margins of notebooks, on receipts, in the Notes app of my phone. Sentences like, maybe they didn't mean to. It doesn't matter. You're not supposed to need that much. Tiny things. Paper fences. That night after dinner, I sat on my couch with a blanket over my lap and opened my phone again. The group chat with my family was still silent. No one had followed up. No check-ins. No questions. I scrolled through old messages, wondering how many times I'd filled the silence so they didn't have to. Photos I'd sent. Updates. Small jokes. All of them unanswered, or answered late. There's a photo of me in that chat, from last year. I'd just finished a freelance project I was proud of. It had taken weeks. Late nights. A rush deadline. I posted the finished product with a short caption. Finally done. Exhausted but happy. No one replied. The next message? My sister's engagement photo. They responded in under 5 minutes. I locked my phone and set it face down. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after you realize something isn't going to change. It's not rage, it's not despair. It's a kind of weightlessness, like letting go of something you were never meant to carry. I opened my laptop and found an old file I'd named Letters I'll Never Send. It was dated almost 3 years ago. I didn't remember what was inside. When I opened it, there were pages, paragraphs addressed to people I'd never been able to speak to out loud. One to my father, one to a college roommate I never really trusted, and one to my sister. That one was shorter, only a few lines. You get the best of them, always have, but sometimes I wish you'd look back and see who's missing. I don't know why I never sent it. Or maybe I do. Maybe I knew it wouldn't land, wouldn't be heard. Maybe I didn't want to risk being told I was making too much of it again, that I was imagining it, that it was just timing, that the hospital wasn't that serious. I've heard all of it before, so I learned not to speak it. But the not speaking builds its own kind of scar tissue. Even now, sitting here, alone in my apartment, the glow of the screen soft on my face, I can feel how much I've tucked away. Whole chapters of pain, stories never told, not because they didn't matter, but because they wouldn't have mattered to them. I used to think that silence was strong, that being private made me better. But sometimes silence is just survival with no exit. I don't regret not telling them. I regret that telling them never felt like an option. There's a poem I saved once. I forget who wrote it. But there's a line that stuck with me. I buried it so deep, I forgot where the grave was. That's how this feels. Like grief, I was never allowed to name, so it wandered, and waited, and now, Now it's starting to speak. It started with a blank screen. No plan, no outline, no real idea what I was doing. Just a slow, restless itch that wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't sleep, not in the usual way. Not the kind where your eyes flutter open once or twice, then drift back down. This was different. I'd lie still for hours, my body exhausted, but something inside me felt awake, and not in a good way, like a door had been opened and left swinging. At first, I cleaned drawers, cabinets, corners of the apartment I hadn't looked at in months. I threw away old receipts, mismatched socks, a stack of unused holiday cards I'd bought years ago, thinking maybe this year I'd send them. I didn't. I kept ending up back at my desk, not doing work, just sitting there, opening folders, scrolling through files, starting and stopping the same way I had in conversations that never went anywhere. There was one folder I hadn't opened since before the hospital. It was called Quiet Tools. I'd created it last fall when I was playing around with some journaling prompts for myself. Just little things. Name something you miss. Write the sentence you never said. Where does your anger live in your body? Nothing fancy, just space. I opened the file and stared at it for a long time. The formatting was sloppy, the fonts were mismatched, but there was something about it that made me feel safe. Like maybe there was still a version of me that wanted to speak, even if it couldn't be out loud. So I fixed the layout, added color, a few soft icons, changed the font to something round and gentle. I didn't think of it as designing, not at first. I just needed to touch something that didn't vanish when I reached for it. That night, I created 4 more pages. I wasn't thinking about sharing them. I wasn't even thinking about finishing them. But I kept going, breath by breath, box by box. A quiet rhythm that didn't ask me to be anyone's daughter. Just a person, making something. I remembered something my therapist said to me years ago. Creation is proof you existed, even when no one else notices. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Now I did. 3 days later, I uploaded the journal pages to Etsy. Not under my real name, not with any marketing or hashtags or clever product titles. Just uploaded. As if to say, I made this, that's all. Not for approval, not for applause. Just to stop disappearing. 2 nights after that, someone bought one. A stranger, no profile picture, no message attached. But the next morning, I saw a review. 6 words. This is exactly what I needed. I didn't cry. But something softened. Something unlatched in my chest, like a window cracked open after a long, breathless winter. Not joy, not pride, just warmth. The tiniest ember of it. That afternoon, I made tea and sat by the window and watched the sky change color. The light moved across the floor slowly, like it was reminding me of time, of motion, of life that wasn't paused just because I was. I picked up my sketchpad and started mapping out a second set of prompts. This one was for people who never got to say goodbye. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was hiding, but because it felt like something I could keep. Something that didn't need to be explained or packaged or folded into someone else's idea of who I was. For once, it didn't have to earn its place. It just belonged. I think sometimes we wait for the world to give us permission to start over, to say it's okay to try again, to say you're allowed to make things, even if they're small, even if no one claps, even if your parents don't notice. But that night, alone in my apartment, with a mug of tea going cold beside me and the glow of the screen resting quiet on my skin, I gave myself permission. Not to be extraordinary, not to be seen, just to be here, and to make something that didn't ask me to explain my grief. I didn't expect anything, not really, not anymore. But I still checked my phone more than I wanted to admit, not in the way I used to, hoping for a call, a long message, some kind of acknowledgement. It was smaller than that now. Just a glance. A flick of the screen. A habit made of soft disappointment. It was a Sunday morning when the voicemail showed up. A little red icon at the top of my screen. No missed call. just the message, left late the night before. I didn't play it right away. I think part of me already knew. I waited until the dishes were done, until the tea was steeping, until the apartment was quiet enough to feel the floor beneath my feet. Then I pressed play. It was my mother's voice, flat, neutral. She asked if I'd gotten her email about the insurance forms, said she wasn't sure if I still needed the family login, then added, as if remembering, "Hope you're back on your feet." That was it. No, sorry. No, we should have been there. Not even, "How are you?" Just logistics. And a hope. I let the message play twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I think I needed to feel how little was in it. There's a silence that follows disappointment, but there's a different kind of silence that comes after clarity. The second one is quieter, but heavier. Like a door that doesn't slam, it just clicks shut. I stared at the phone for a long time after. The screen dimmed. The icon disappeared. And I just sat there, not sad exactly, just still. I wanted to believe there was something else coming, some later message, some carefully worded letter they hadn't found the courage to send. But that voicemail was it. And it sounded like everything else they'd ever said to me. Brief, distant, safe. There was a time when I would have written back. Not just out of politeness, out of instinct. I would have filled the space with gratitude. Said thank you for checking in. Said I was doing okay. Said I understood. But this time, I didn't respond. Not out of anger, just refusal. I sat down on the floor beside my bookshelf and pulled out the box where I keep old phones. Chargers tangled around each other like vines. A few dried-out pens. A notebook I didn't remember owning. And then, at the bottom, an old flip phone from years ago. The kind that used to blink when you had a message. That little blue light pulsing like a heartbeat. I turned it on. It buzzed twice. No SIM card, but it lit up enough for me to scroll. There were voicemails on that one too. Old ones. From college. From the year I moved out. From the first time I called home crying. I clicked through them slowly. Most of them were from my sister, a few from my dad, but not one, not even one, from my mother. That's the part I hadn't noticed until just then. She was always there in the group photos, always there in the background, but not once had she been the one to say, "Call me back, I miss you." Not once had her voice reached me when I wasn't in the room. It hit me then, in the quiet hum of that old phone, what I'd been waiting for all this time. Not an apology, not even forgiveness, just a message. Proof that I mattered when no one was watching, that I was thought of when the camera wasn't pointed my way. I set the phone down and leaned my head against the wall. The wood was cool behind my neck, the kind of grounding cold that reminds you you're here. Still here. There's a grief that comes when someone you love dies, but there's a different grief, quieter but just as deep, when someone you love just never shows up. Not because they can't, but because they don't know how. I think I've always believed she meant well, that she was trying, that maybe it was hard for her to say the things I needed, that maybe softness just wasn't something she learned, but even now, even with all that grace, I still wish she'd called. I still wish she'd said it. I deleted the voicemail that night. No backup, no archive, no long note about closure, just a soft press of a button, and silence. It was the day before Thanksgiving, gray light through the windows, rain, soft and thin, like it didn't know whether to stay or leave. I didn't have plans, not because no one invited me, though no one did, but because, for the first time, I didn't want to be somewhere I wasn't wanted. The apartment was quiet, not heavy, not hollow, just still. I moved slowly that morning, folded the laundry, watered the plant by the window, lit a candle that smelled like cedar and orange peel. Little things, but done gently, like I was preparing to host myself. Around noon, I pulled out one plate, one fork, one cloth napkin I'd been saving for no reason in particular. I set them on the table, not in a hurry, not to impress. Just because I could. There's something strange about setting a table for one. It's not the loneliness exactly. It's the noticing, Every sound feels sharper, every gesture more deliberate. There's no distraction, only presence. I roasted vegetables, baked a small round of cornbread in a pan my aunt gave me years ago. No turkey, no stuffing, no long list of ingredients, just enough. Just enough to say, I matter to me. I don't remember the last time I ate a holiday meal without holding my breath, without shrinking in a chair that never seemed to be mine. This one, this one was different. I sat down slowly, tucked the napkin onto my lap, closed my eyes. No one to bless the food. No clinking of wine glasses. No performance. Just a whisper inside me. I'm here. I took the first bite and didn't rush the second. Chewed slowly. Felt the warmth move down my throat, into my chest. The candle flickered. The sky outside dimmed a little more. But I didn't feel small. I felt real. Afterward, I washed the plate by hand, dried it with the soft towel I usually keep folded under the sink, and then I lit a second candle. Not because the room needed more light, but because I did. A small act. For the version of me who waited at so many tables and never felt seen. For the version who used to shrink to make space. Who used to watch others be celebrated and thought that was enough. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I was full. And grief has a different shape when there's something solid beneath it. Later that evening, I opened my Etsy shop dashboard. I hadn't checked it in a while. There were 5 new messages, all from different people. One said, I used your grief prompts last night. I hadn't cried in months. Thank you. Another wrote, I gave this to my daughter. She said it helped her say something she'd been holding. I read each one slowly, out loud even, and somewhere between the 4th and 5th message, I smiled. Not because I felt proud, but because I felt connected. I didn't reply right away. I just let the words stay open on the screen, like company. Like something warm that didn't need anything from me. Later, I lit one more candle. This one wasn't for the version of me who hurt, and it wasn't for the family who didn't come. It was for the space in between. The quiet I chose. The light I allowed. The place I set for myself. Not out of spite, not out of drama, but out of tenderness. I used to think presence had to be given to you, that it had to be invited, that someone else had to pull out the chair and say, come sit here. We saved a spot for you. But now I know. You can set it for yourself. You can say, this is mine, this meal, this moment, this life. And no one has to clap. No one has to notice. The candle burned quietly for hours. I didn't blow it out until I was ready to sleep. And even then, I whispered something small as I turned away. Not a prayer, not a wish. Just this. Thank you for staying. The first time I noticed I wasn't waiting. It was so quiet, I almost missed it. I had just finished washing the dishes. The kitchen smelled like lemon soap. The light through the window had that golden tint it only gets for a few minutes at the end of the day. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I didn't reach for it. Not out of restraint, not out of anger, just because I wasn't expecting anything. That used to be unthinkable. There was a time when I built whole afternoons around that little sound. A text, a check-in, a crumb of acknowledgement from someone who only showed up when it was convenient. But now the silence feels like mine. I still think about the hospital sometimes. The IV, the quiet beep behind my ear, the way I watched the door, believing it would open. It didn't, but something else did. Something inside me, something that had been standing there for years, holding out a chair no one ever sat in. That part of me finally sat down. Without waiting. I teach now. Not in a classroom, not full-time. Just something small, once a week. A quiet, private group. Mostly women, mostly people like me. People who know how it feels to be too much and not enough in the same breath. I don't call it coaching. I don't use words like healing or transformation. I just say we're gathering. To write. To name things. To remember who we are when no one's watching. The first time I told them about the hospital, I expected someone to flinch, to ask why I was being dramatic, to say I should let it go, to suggest maybe they really didn't know. But no one did. They just listened, nodded slowly. And one woman, a soft-voiced mother of 3, said, "That happened to me too." And something inside me melted. Some nights, I still light a candle. Not for ceremony, not to mark grief, just to say, I'm here. The same way I did that Thanksgiving. The same way I'll keep doing in all the small rooms of my life. I used to think freedom would feel like running, like leaving. But for me, it feels like standing still, breathing, not apologizing, not wondering if the next message will be the one that saves me. Because I don't need saving anymore. I don't reach for the phone like I used to. I don't refresh the family thread. I don't check to see if they saw my post. If they did, they didn't say anything. And if they didn't, I survived that too. Last week, someone from my group sent me a photo. It was a printed copy of one of my journal prompts, taped to their bathroom mirror. A sentence I wrote months ago, not even thinking it would land. What part of you is still waiting for someone who's already gone? Underneath it, she'd written in blue pen, "Not anymore." I sat with that photo for a long time. Not proud, not triumphant, just still. Because that's what this has become. A life that doesn't need proof. A voice that doesn't need permission. I wish I could go back to the girl in the hospital bed. The one checking the door. The one refreshing her messages. I wouldn't tell her that it gets easier. I wouldn't tell her that they come around. Because they didn't. But I'd tell her this. You come around. You come home to yourself. This morning, I opened my window early. The sky was pale. The street was quiet. I poured my tea, sat down at the desk. No music, no notifications. Just the sound of my own breath and the light crawling slowly across the floor. And I thought, this is the message I needed. This is it. This life. This moment. No one had to deliver it. Because I'm already here. And maybe that's the real shift. Not needing the apology. Not needing them to see it the way I did. Just learning to stay with myself. Quietly. Fully. Without waiting. If this felt like your story too, even in pieces, you're not alone here. Leave me a word if you want, just one. I'll read it like a memory we're finally allowed to keep. Thanks for sitting with me.